Hey, I'm Alex Wackle from Board Game Co.
I'm Professor Meg.
And today we're reviewing Ironwood for Mind Clash Games. Ironwood is a one or two player asymmetric game of different warring factions. This over here is a prototype, all rules and components subject to change, and I'll have a link to the campaign page down below. This is a pre-order campaign over on GameFound. But with that, let's go ahead and dive into this. I'm going to give you a brief overview of how the game plays, and then we'll discuss our thoughts, but let's go ahead and move this to the side for right now. Ironwood, like I said already, is a two-player asymmetric game. I mentioned one or two-player because there's also a solo mode for each of the asymmetric sides, meaning regardless of which faction you're playing as, there's a different solo mode with different rules that will walk you through how to deal with in a solo game. As far as the general idea, assuming you're playing two-player for a second, the general idea is you have two factions. You have the Ironclad and the Woodwalkers. The Woodwalkers start on the external edge of the forest, on these outer forests over here, which are immune from combat. You can't really engage in fights over here. Meanwhile, the Ironwood start on these mountains, and in general in the game, the Woodwalkers move on the forest, the Ironwood move on the mountains, the Ironclad move on the mountains over here. That's how they're going to be moving over there, but combat will happen between any adjacent areas. So from here is fine, here to here is fine as well, but you can't fight to or from an outer forest. Each of the factions has their own goal as far as how they actually win the game. The Ironclad are trying to build three forges plus the one they start with over here in Ferrum. They're trying to build three forges on the outer mountains. So on any of these spots, they're going to have the opportunity to go ahead and start a forge over here, and they'll have the opportunity to flip it over there, and they'll be able to go ahead and build a forge, do that 3 times, and they win the game. Meanwhile, the Woodwalkers are trying to recover their visions. They're going to have the opportunity through this deck of vision cards over here. They'll start with one of them, but they have the opportunity to draw more of them. These will represent certain areas on the board. So for example, Argentina are over here, which means if they go to over here, and they are on an inner forest, so not in the outer forest, they move to an inner forest, and they have the opportunity to go ahead and discover, they'll show that they go ahead and they can start putting down a vision onto the board. That vision will go on the board, at which point they can try to take that vision and move to an outer forest, taking the vision with them. That's how they're going to have the opportunity to go ahead and take that. Now they have to have no opposing Ironclad forces there, which effectively means they need to deal with the Ironclad once they know where a vision is, reveal the vision, and then remove it to the outer forest. And they have to do that 3 times, so they're going to track their visions over here. So again, each faction trying to do different things, but one of 3 things, 3 forges or 3 visions, and they're trying to go ahead and deal with the enemy that's in their way throughout the game. Which brings us to the general turn structure. The general turn structure, and it's all printed on your player board, there's slight differences. So for example, the Ironwood gain 2 crystals, the Woodwalkers gain 1, then they're going to draw some cards, remove markers from existing cards, which will make more sense later, and then they have the opportunity to go through the action phase where they're going to play 3 cards alternating back and forth, with the Woodwalkers always going first. Now the cards you're going to have is going to be a combination of 3 cards that are always the default cards for those factions that give you the core actions you need, plus you're going to be drawing cards every round from your deck full of completely unique and different cards, and you're going to choose from those cards, taking an action, playing one of those cards, possibly your default ones, possibly one of your special ones, taking the actions shown in the card. Now those will generally be a combination of moving around the board, of attacking each other, of gathering resources, more cards, more crystals, things like that. There's also unique aspects. So for example, the Ironclad both have these little stronger iron golems, which are stronger troops on the board. They also have this drill that's slowly moving around the board collecting gems, because they need those gems. That's going to be the main way they turn these things into forges, is by collecting as many gems as possible. Meanwhile, the Woodwalkers are trying to ambush the drill, gather those resources. They're trying to attack Ferrum, where they can get the various crystals and gems that the Ironclad have already accumulated, and they're trying to make sure they can get enough area control that they reveal those visions, and do so with enough pressure that they can go ahead and pull back. Now there's a bunch of other things to get into. I'll focus on a few small ones, but I'm not going to go into every little detail. Combat in the game is going to involve one player initiating a combat with one of their action cards, and when they do so, the players have a chance to go ahead and play a card simultaneously face down from their hands and compare the attributes on them. And again, you can play your standard card that will come back to you every single round, or you can play your unique cards, which are a little better, but you're using up a resource because you're using up a card. You're going to go ahead and compare your strength, your offensive strength to the defensive strength on each side. That will determine the number of casualties you inflict between 2 warring factions. Then after that's done, so for example, in this case over here, if this was a battle going on here, we have the Ironclad doing 0 combat against 0 shields, and the Woodwalkers doing 1 damage against 1 shield, resulting in basically no one dying. From there, you'll count the remaining units on the board, so 3 versus 2. You'll add up the total strength over here, so additional 2 and 2, which means the Ironclad win 5 against 4 against the Woodwalkers. No casualties are inflicted, but they can force the Woodwalkers to retreat where they want in the game. And that's going to be true in general for both sides. There's the winning the combat, there's casualties, and there's forcing the players to retreat. That will help you set you up for success, being able to build your forges, being able to recall your visions, and trying to manage your resources as you go through all of that. But that's generally the main things you need to know to deal with this game engine. The rest of them are are going to be small details, how the drill operates, how various other small elements operate, but that's the core idea. Anything I missed?
Oh, I don't know.
That's a fair question, fair thing. So,
I would say the only thing maybe is, did you explain the white markers that they go on cards for? I'm not even sure why.
yeah. So some of the cards you're going to have in the game are going to be recurring cards. So if you go ahead and find some of them over here, we can find this one over here. This is going to be an example of a recurring card where you're going to mark the card with these markers over here, putting these markers onto the card, and then at the end of the round, the card's going to move up to the top where it's going to stay in play, having a recurring impact based on whatever the card is. So for example, this one is each combat gives a plus defense and plus attack if you are the defender. It's entrenchment. It helps the Ironclad set themselves up for success, but those cards have a limited amount of how long they're going to last. There are ways to add markers using other cards. That's the basic idea of the ongoing cards.
And to be fair, I played as the Woodwalkers, and there are many more of those in the Ironclad deck. So just to clarify, I didn't use them, and yeah.
Speaking of the various sides over here, you're going to have the solo modes in the game. The solo modes are going to be 2 different solo modes for each side, both of them giving you a directive of how they operate. For myself, I've played through both of the solo modes. I have found that they are not, well, let's start getting to review territory here, which we'll dabble back in a second, but I do find that they weren't overly complicated to follow. Some, well, we'll talk about in the review. But I didn't find they were overly complicated to follow, and they did give a good sense of the strategic decisions that I find each faction would go through. So for example, if you're playing as the Ironclad, or if you're playing as the Woodwalkers, say, the Ironclad very specifically have a tree of how they operate a little bit more offensively, aggressively, defensively, and that will change based on the situation on the board. If you have a vision that you're trying to gather, they're going to try to hunt you down, versus if you don't, they're going to try to build forges. I found it very intuitive and logical in the way it went through, which, again, bordering on review stuff over here, but now we'll go ahead and move into the review, starting off with, I guess, ease of play. Ease of play over here in general for ease of play, and this is a bit trickier. I know I went through the rulebook on this one, but I found it for the most part fairly straightforward in the rules. The rulebook's a little longer than it might seem, which means like the rulebook seems longer. The actual game is only half the rulebook because at that point you start moving into strategy tips and then the individual solo modes. So even though the rulebook seems a bit more intimidating, there's not actually as many pages as it seems to be able to get you up and running. Game time I found came in, depending if solo or 2-player, anywhere between the 60 to 90 minute range I found. Probably closest to the 60 minute in general, but I have had some of the, at least one of the solo games I had ran a little long. But as far as what we like, don't like, and consider as not liking, and this is where we can go ahead and jump in.
Well, for ease of play, I would say too, something I really like to talk about is like the accessibility of like iconography. And I think the battle was so easy because it is just these two factions, so you can easily pair them to be mirrored of each other, that I really did feel that the combat was so intuitive, that it was very snappy. I enjoyed it, even though it was intuitive, but it was a bit different, that depending, like, you don't only want to just do damage, but you want to have the victory points at the end to have the victory overall.
Yep.
For majority. So depending on the cards you play, it can really change things. That I think that for ease of play, the way that it's presented is presented really well.
Yeah, I did like the combat system overall, and I don't believe you've played Kemet, right?
No.
Yeah, so it very much has a similar combat system from Kemet if you've played that, where you're focusing on both how much damage or defense you want to have, so that's going to help you set you for success, because sometimes I might lose a combat, but I'll go ahead and take your forces out in the meantime, but you're also trying to focus on your overall battle strength. It leads to fun decisions, especially when you're dealing with cards, where you always have these basic cards. They'll come back to you. You expend them in combat, they're going to come back to you, but the better cards, they aren't coming back to you. So that trade-off of the effectiveness of your cards is another thing that adds a resource management to the game while you're engaging in the combats. I like that as well. Yeah. For myself, I'm going to dive into, we can go back and forth into different things. The first thing I'll say that I loved about this is the general presentation and the aesthetic of the game. Even going down to the fact how the Ironclad have these metal markers that feel all intimidating and metal, and then we have wooden tokens for the Woodwalkers. Even just that small component adjustment based on the factions just really cemented the feeling of the various factions. You have this intimidating taking over the mountains, mining ore, setting yourself up, and then you have the nimble Woodwalkers running around, and they are nimble. The way they move in the game, the Ironclad can often move a big grouping of people very effectively, and the Woodwalkers often can move individual people around the board much quicker, setting themselves up so the Ironclad have to constantly be on edge as to where that next vision might pop up and who's trying to escape with it. So I like the general aesthetic and art and production of the game already, and it's very much in the prototype phase.
Alex, I'm gonna go off script right now. Out of section. I wanna do the recommendations first.
Sounds like a plan.
Because I think I know what yours might be, but we don't usually talk about this first, and I have two specific ones.
I remembered one of mine. I can't remember what the other was, but I can look.
So,
Anyways.
yeah, I did feel this was very intuitive. I do really like when it's asymmetric like this, especially when it's 2 players, that you know that you can feel that it's like a balanced challenge going back and forth, but it does feel different enough that like I did definitely feel you were ahead at certain points, but because we're going for slightly different things and achieving them different ways, and you're also trying to like stop your opponent but also help yourself and do what you want to do, I kind of like when it's asymmetric like that, because you can focus more on your own puzzle. You're like, it's almost like racing to the top of a ladder, where you're like, I just have to get there first, and whatever I need to do, I'm gonna go up my rope ladder, even though you might be like climbing a rock mountain.
Yeah, the word race is very interesting there, because I totally agree with the idea that it feels like a race. The game is basically each player trying to do their own thing, and then there's always a bit of a back and forth of, do I want to continue pushing what I think I can get done, or do I need to pivot and start playing defensively? Because it really starts off as a race, and then it turns into, do I need to trip my opponent? Not that you should do that in races. But effectively, that's the feeling I have as I play through this. And again, that's true both solo and competitively, but you're trying to get your objectives done. And depending on which faction you are, depending on how the game's going, depending on how the cards come out, you'll find that one faction starts getting their objective, and the other player has to figure out how to adapt and react. And there's a lot of opportunities of how to adapt. There is trying to race faster. There is trying to get in their way. There's trying to set yourself up for the next objective, letting them get this one in. There's a lot of card play going on, a lot of different cards. The sheer variety of the cards, you have the 3 basic cards, which are always there.
To shout out to the cards, there was one card in particular that I felt so powerful that I think often we say, I really want that thing that made me feel good and I want to get it again. And after playing it, I was like, how often do we shuffle this? How quickly do you go through the deck? Because I really want this back. And you don't really... I think there may be multiple copies of it. I think there are.
Well, strictly speaking, if you go through the deck, you will get your cards back, but you don't go through most of your cards in a typical game.
But there's definitely that flow of some are helpful, some are the ones that you want to use for their different battle points, and some really make you feel powerful when you tactically lay up what you need to do.
Yeah, and the card play, that sequence of playing 3 cards every single round and being able to predict or know the back and forth between players really gives you a lot of agency. Again, to combining your special cards, focusing on abilities that will give you card draw, so you can cycle through your better cards better, so you can have those turns where you get just a bit more done, where you go ahead and, where you're attacking somebody in the forest over here. Well, technically it's an outer forest, you can't actually attack over there, but in general, the sequence of trying to set yourself up for a bunch of card plays in a row based on your current hand, trying to take into account the combat dynamics of what you're going to push forward on, and just making sure you're set up for what you're doing. If you're playing as the Ironclad, you can have the drill moving around various spots trying to collect more gems, but you need to make sure that you not abandon Ferrum too quickly, because that can be a pressure point of somebody charging in there and just stealing your resources, which will help them get ahead in a game that every single resource, from cards to units to gems, everything matters in this game. I thought there was a lot of interesting decision play from what is effectively an asymmetric 2-player head-to-head game, but with a strong focus on the actual cards and how they operate, which actually, by the way, fun fact, that made me remember what my other recommendation was going to be.
Good.
Yes.
Because you're going to need it.
That little line, yeah.
Yeah, something about the card play. This is like a little bit spoilery, but just to kind of understand the flow of how things are, you do get to play the 3 cards. And for me as the Woodwalkers, you have a card where you discover, and that means that you populate the vision, but you can't be there, and one of my people should be there to grab it and run it out. So it's very dangerous to show it off. That there were a couple times where I was playing it as my second card, hoping you'll have already lined something else up, and just hope you'll go for that plan, and I can like secretly grab it at the end. Honestly, I never discovered it as my third card, and I wonder if that would have been a good tactic against you too.
We didn't talk about the visions. The visions actually have an expiry. At the end of each round, they're going to slowly fade. So you have 2 rounds to collect a vision once it's been exposed. So you have to be careful of that. But you also, as the Woodwalkers, have tools that let you move twice in one move. Generally, movement's always going to be limited to 1 unit at a time per card, but you can go ahead and have some options where you can pay a card or pay some sort of benefit or sacrifice or whatnot to be able to get that additional movement, which will really help you out as you go through this. So overall, I thought there was a very solid back and forth in the game. It often felt balanced. I don't think there's a single game I played of this where it felt like one side was clearly going to win. It always felt like you had to fight to gain any ground, and the players have the various tools to, again, either race for themselves or try to get in their way. But I I really appreciated the balance or the feel of balance in the game.
This is something that may be silly, but the map almost kind of, as the Woodland Walkers, you come in from the outsides, and it's a little silly, but it reminds me a bit of Zelda in the first Zelda game, where you're stuck in like the beginning for a bit and you're in this crater where you're protected and then you move out. So I kind of like that you move in, that I was also able to use the edges to kind of maneuver my people around and know that they wouldn't be attacked, and then be able to move in certain areas as well.
Yeah, especially as you get to the mid-game, you'll find there's an interesting... you start off with enough units in the game, and there are ways to get more units in the game. But it gets to this weird point where you're slowly pinging away at each other's units, and you have to figure out the right tempo or flow as to when you want to devote your resources and time to building up more units, versus when you think you can get enough done without expending your energy there. Which, again, going back to the nature of the game and how it can play out multiple ways, in some games you'll be focusing on more unit generation, you'll have more units in the combat on the board. Other times you might find yourself whittling each other down to a few units in the board, and if that happens, I personally find that favors the Woodwalkers more, because they're a bit more nimble. So if you can get the Ironclad a bit weaker, then the Woodwalkers can dance around the board faster, versus the Ironclad have a hard time keeping up. So as the Ironclad player, you really need to be on top of that, but that takes resources, and resources are the main thing you're trying to use to actually build your forges, hence the whole delicate back and forth.
Yeah, I would say for the Woodwalkers, if they're not better at moving around, then they can just continuously keep stealing your gems.
Yes.
So that you're just building toward nothing, because they can just keep pinging you for that.
That's why you want to defend Ferrum over there.
Yeah.
But past that, one thing I'll talk about as far as the solo modes, I mentioned briefly the solo modes, I overall like them, but solo modes, as far as the solo modes, I thought they did a good job representing the feeling of playing as the other player. The one critique I would have around them is I did feel, and this might go down to the prototype phase, especially if you're playing against the Ironclad, you're supposed to be tracking different markers, but the way the sheet's structured, you kind of have to pick up the sheet to frequently see the symbols until you learn them. Small little quality of life thing. I thought that the overall presentation of the solo mode is great. There's a small little nitpick around the play rate and the accessibility there. Outside of that, there's ways, they have a whole difficulty modulation around these the solo modes as well, where there's like a scale of like 1 to 15 or whatnot, as far as different things you can do to modify the difficulty, which means if you are having a challenging, or if you're having either too challenging a time or not challenging enough, you do have the flexibility to adjust those to a good gaming experience that's going to work for wherever you're up to over there. As far as anything you don't like with the game?
I think I would need to spend more time with it, honestly. This one is one that is very much my playstyle and my jam. This is something that I don't like, which I think may touch to some of you out there, but I very much only want to play as the Woodwalkers. I do not want to play as the Ironclad, and that will go on to my recommendations. You guys will know what I'm talking about. But I very much don't want to play as the industrial side coming in. So if you have two players that both want to be that more defending natural side, that may be difficult, because you are warring factions where it doesn't feel equal. It is asymmetric. So if the theme or something like that is hard and you don't have someone that wants to play that side, I think that could be difficult.
For me, the only thing I really have, I don't have a lot of complaints about this game. Well, spoilers to Final Thoughts, but I really enjoyed this one. But the one thing I would say is that I do find that because of the nature of having these default cards for each faction, which are the main cards you're playing, I appreciate the stability and reliability, and even the decision spaces around when do you use your default card versus when do you use the more advanced cards. But it also does mean that some of the gameplay is a little static. You're playing it, maybe 30% of your game time is spent doing the same things again and again, and that's not, again, it overall works. I'm almost fishing for something to complain about over here, but it would be almost interesting to see a fully card-driven system, as opposed to kind of the way this feels is you have default actions on top of a card-driven system on top. So that's the only real complaint I have. Small degrees of, I guess my concern would be that it makes it a drop more static game to game, as opposed to really mixing it up. But again, you still do have those interesting actions throughout the game, so it's kind of a small complaint, not really a big one. As far as final thoughts on this one, how are you feeling with this one?
I really enjoyed it. Again, I think my only caveat is with games like this, I do very much tend toward a certain side, and that almost makes it a 50-50 game, because if you have a friend that also wants that same side, that can be really difficult.
You straight up wouldn't play as Ironclad?
I don't think I'd like it. I think I would do it to teach someone and then be like, no, I'm always this one, right? And I think it is that thing where I like the wooden tokens. I think it's something where the production quality is so high, I want to favor a certain faction. And that, again, you just need someone that wants to play as the other side. And that, again, I think you were saying fishing for things. That's me trying to fish for something I don't like about it, is I don't really want to play as one of the factions that it comes with. That being said, if there were more factions that were just even a little bit diversified that somehow came out in expansions or something, I think I'd really enjoy that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about that. I don't know what Minecraft's plans are for this title, but the idea of having different factions that all manage to operate and
right. I mean, look at the
operate,
box where it's like yellow and silver.
Yeah.
Like if they do it like that, and you always have to pick one side or the other, I could get more into it, I think.
Yeah, I'm curious what the plans are. I don't. This is very well balanced around what it's trying to do. So adding other, I'm curious.
Give me Ironclad pandas.
Ironclad, Minecraft. Yeah, you know what to do now.
Ironclad pandas.
But overall, final thoughts, rating.
Oh my gosh! And then woodland foxes together. Can you imagine? Sorry, what was the question?
Final thoughts and rating.
Final thoughts. This one is very high for me. I'm gonna give it a 4. A 4 with the little star that with Board Game Co. I have to do 3.5 to 4.
You don't have to do 3.5 to 4.
I'll give it a 3.75.
Oh, now I understand the question. Yes, you have to do the 0.5s.
I don't think I do.
0.5
You just said
system.
no. I give it a 3.75. First ever on the Board Game Co. channel, 3.75.
For me, I really enjoyed this one a lot. I played through this several times. I played through both solo modes. I actually do prefer the Ironclad, but I do like the Woodwalkers too.
Oh, that was another caveat. I haven't tried the solo mode, and I want to.
Yeah, I really enjoy this one a lot. I've had a lot of fun going through this. I found that so far it consistently gives me a challenge as far as trying to figure out the pain points and how to push a little further. I've won, I've lost, I've had a good time with this a lot. For me, this is a 4.5.
We laughed, we cried.
For me, this is a 4.5 out of 5.
4.5?
I really like this game. This is a really solid one for me. I've had a lot of fun going through this one, and I'm excited to continue to dive into it. I do hope they have more factions or sets or something in the universe. My one concern with stuff like this, especially with only 2 factions, is does it eventually become stale? I don't know yet, but for right now, I'm really enjoying this one.
Yeah, for me, that's exactly what I need is 2 more factions and to try out the solo mode.
Yeah. And then recommendations, you want to start?
Yes, my first recommendation is Spirit Island.
That's what your word I would take?
One of them.
Oh, okay.
Because Spirit Island is definitely one where you are maneuvering around a board with different species, where it's co-op instead. But there is that heavy theme of the island versus the colonizers. And I do think it's a very fun puzzle as well, of moving around a similar type, setup.
Yeah.
And then my other one is Root,
Yes.
which is one that we discussed, where you have the asymmetric factions that are going for different things, and especially maneuvering around a board like this where you are both inside the forest and inside the different cities and the adjacency that is around that, it has very much that feeling.
Yeah, for me, Root was an obvious pick as far as the general feeling. The very much operating on the same board with similar mechanics but different goals. But for me, the other one that did feel very similar to was Watergate. It very much has a push and pull mechanism where you are trying to operate your own little tug of war on your things, just very thematically pulled into the game in a way that doesn't feel that dry. But Watergate is very card driven, unique cards that drive your actions, and I overall got a similar feeling of the competing sides while being very different in so many other aspects. But I highly recommend checking out Watergate if you enjoy this game. In any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co.
I'm Professor Meg.
And have a good one.
Bye.